he pulled up an airplane wreck that he later realized looked like the kind of airplane that Glenn Miller disappeared in.
December 15th, 1944, under the foggy skies of Europe, a small plane vanishes without a trace, carrying with it one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century. Glenn Miller, the legendary bandleader whose music inspired millions, was en route to Paris, but he would never arrive. Now, 80 years later, on an equally foggy morning, scientists conducting a routine sonar sweep over the English Channel make a remarkable discovery.
It's a plane!
Could this be the key to finally unraveling what happened to the legendary bandleader? Early life. Alton Glenn Miller, born in Clarinda, Iowa, was the son of Mattie Lou Miller and Louis Elmer Miller. During high school, he decided to add an extra N to his middle name, turning Glenn into Glenn, just like his father, Louis Elmer, and his siblings, Elmer Dean, John Herbert, and Emma Irene. Miller was known by his middle name, Glenn. According to Dennis Sprague from the Glenn Miller Archives, Miller used his first name, Alton, for legal and official purposes, which is why it's seen on documents like his military records and driver's licenses. His formal name, Alton G. Miller, is listed on the tablets of the missing at the Cambridge American Cemetery and Memorial in England. His memorial headstone at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia reads, Major Alton Glenn Miller, U.S. Army, Air Corps. A memorial tree, dedicated on December 15th, 1994, the 50th anniversary of his death, stands in Section 13 on Wilson Drive, honoring the veterans of the Major Glenn Miller Army Air Forces Orchestra. Miller began his education in North Platte, Nebraska, before his family moved to Grant City, Missouri in 1915. There, he earned enough money from milking cows to buy his first trombone and joined the town orchestra. Although he initially played the cornet and mandolin, he switched to the trombone by 1916. In 1918, the family relocated to Fort Morgan, Colorado, where Miller attended Fort Morgan High School. In the fall of 1919, he joined the FMHS Maroons football team, which won the Northern Colorado American Football Conference in 1920. Miller earned the title of Best Left End in Colorado in 1921. He also contributed as an editor for his high school yearbook, Memories, for 2 years. Interestingly, his name was spelled both as Glenn and Glenn in the yearbooks he edited. The birth of a musical icon. Glenn Miller's musical journey took off when he moved to the vibrant streets of New York City. There, he dove headfirst into the Schillinger system of music composition and arrangement, a revolutionary approach led by the renowned Joseph Schillinger. Under Schillinger's mentorship, Miller crafted a piece originally named Miller's Tune, which would later be rebranded as Moonlight Serenade. This enchanting melody became Miller's signature, showcasing his distinctive style and setting him apart in the world of music. In 1926, Miller hit the road, touring with various bands and eventually joining Ben Pollock's orchestra in Los Angeles. He also played alongside the talented Victor Young, soaking up knowledge from some of the era's finest musicians. Initially, Miller stood out as the leading trombone soloist, but his prominence was overshadowed when the exceptionally skilled Jack Teagarden joined the band. This shift made Miller realize that his true talent lay not just in performing, but in arranging and composing music. By 1928, he had published 125 jazz breaks for trombone, a testament to his prowess in arranging. While with Pollock's band, Miller composed several pieces, including his debut work, Room 1411, co-written with the emerging jazz legend Benny Goodman. In 1928, after relocating back to New York, Miller reunited with his college sweetheart, Helen Berger, and they married. He then joined Red Nichols and his Five Pennies, contributing to the pit bands for Broadway hits like Strike Up the Band and Girl Crazy, working with notable names such as Benny Goodman and Gene Krupa. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, Miller's career flourished. He freelanced as a trombonist with jazz giants like Tommy Dorsey, Benny Goodman, and Joe Venuti. His arrangements for the Dorsey brothers produced hits like Annie's Cousin Fanny and Tomorrow's Another Day. In 1935, Miller took on a significant role in leading an American orchestra for British bandleader Ray Noble. This experience was crucial in shaping his signature sound, a lead clarinet supported by 4 saxophones, a style that would define his big band. Miller even appeared in the film The Big Broadcast of 1936, performing with the Ray Noble Orchestra alongside stars like Dorothy Dandridge and the Nicholas Brothers, who would later work with him on other projects. Despite his successes with various groups, nothing compared to the impact and success of his own iconic band, Miller's signature sound. In 1937, Miller took a daring leap by starting his own band. Unfortunately, it didn't quite hit the high notes he'd hoped for. The band struggled to make a name for itself amidst a sea of musical competitors, and by 1938, it was clear that the venture wasn't going as planned. Even the legendary Benny Goodman couldn't help but offer a bit of advice, telling Miller, "I don't know, Glenn. You just stay with it." But Miller was not one to be easily discouraged. Determined to carve out a unique niche, he decided to experiment with a sound that would set him apart. His idea was revolutionary, using the clarinet to play the melody, while a tenor saxophone played the same note an octave lower, and the remaining saxophones harmonized within a single octave. This fresh approach would soon become Miller's signature. A lucky break came when music manager George T. Simon introduced Miller to a talented saxophonist named Wilbur Schwartz. Miller hired Schwartz, but rather than having him play saxophone, he made him the lead clarinetist. This bold decision added a distinctive edge to Miller's music, creating a style that was instantly recognizable and distinct from the many other bands of the late 1930s. In a 1909 interview with Metronome magazine, Miller shared his secret to standing out. While other bands often rely on the same old tricks for intros and transitions, our style is different. Our 5th saxophone player, who mostly plays the clarinet, helps make our music unique and memorable. September 1938 was a turning point for Miller, when the Glenn Miller Orchestra signed with Bluebird Records, part of RCA Victor, thanks to businessman Cy Shribman. This deal marked the beginning of their success. The band's fortunes changed with a standout performance at the Meadowbrook Ballroom in New Jersey, followed by a historic show at the Glen Island Casino in New Rochelle, New York, where they set a new attendance record. By 1939, the Miller Orchestra had exploded into the American musical scene. Their lively tunes were the heartbeat of jukeboxes nationwide, with Time magazine hailing their records as some of the most beloved in the country. Their 1940 smash hit, Tuxedo Junction, was a record breaker, selling a staggering 115,000 copies within just a week, solidifying their status as a chart-topping phenomenon. Their rise to fame continued with a landmark performance at Carnegie Hall in October. Here, they shared the stage with other big band legends like Paul Whiteman, Benny Goodman, and Fred Waring. But their influence extended well beyond the concert hall. From December 1939 to September 1942, they captivated radio audiences with a weekly show on CBS, sponsored by Chesterfield Cigarettes. The first 13 weeks of the show featured the Andrews Sisters, adding an extra sparkle to their already dazzling broadcasts. In 1942, the Glenn Miller Orchestra reached a historic milestone by receiving the first ever gold record for their hit, Chattanooga Choo Choo. This achievement marked a high point in their career, highlighting their immense popularity. The song, driven by the dynamic vocals of Gordon Tex Beneke, Paula Kelly, and the Modernaires, along with Miller's signature style, captured the upbeat spirit of the era and became an enduring classic. The orchestra's talents weren't confined to the radio waves. They made memorable appearances in 2 20th Century Fox films, Sun Valley Serenade and Orchestra Wives. In Sun Valley Serenade, they were featured prominently alongside comedian Milton Berle, delivering a memorable performance of Chattanooga Choo Choo. The following year, they returned to the silver screen in Orchestra Wives, a musical comedy drama that explored the lives of the band members and their spouses on tour, with a young Jackie Gleason making a humorous appearance as the band's bassist. While the public adored Miller's music, some jazz critics were less impressed. They criticized the band's polished sound, arguing it lacked the raw spontaneity and improvisation of true jazz. Some even accused Miller of prioritizing commercial success over artistic authenticity. Miller's response was clear: "I don't want a jazz band." He understood his audience's desires perfectly and delivered them with unmatched precision and consistency. Some critics, like Doug Ramsey, felt that Miller's style was too predictable and lacked real depth or originality. They believed his music followed a formula that didn't push boundaries, but not everyone agreed. Jazz critics like Gunther Schuller and Gary Giddens stood up for Miller, arguing that his music had a special charm that connected deeply with listeners. Giddens even likened Miller's famous Moonlight Serenade to a Pavlovian response, triggering an emotional reaction in people that few other songs could ever achieve. While Schuller acknowledged that Miller's sound had its flaws, including some shaky vocals from his singers, he also recognized Miller's drive and ambition. Schuller believed that if Miller had lived longer, his musical legacy could have been even more profound. The debate over Glenn Miller's contribution to music still sparks lively discussions. Some see him as just a commercial success, while others view him as a pioneer who reshaped the big band era. No matter what side you're on, it's impossible to ignore the huge impact Miller had on popular music and his lasting reputation as one of the most cherished bandleaders in history. The Glenn Miller Orchestra was much more than just a band with catchy tunes. They made a splash in Hollywood too. Their talent shined not only on the stage, but also on the silver screen in two big movies produced by 20th Century Fox. The first of these films was the 1941 hit Sun Valley Serenade, where Glenn Miller and his orchestra were front and center. In this fun, snow-filled musical, they shared the spotlight with the witty Milton Berle and treated audiences to a show-stopping performance of their chart-topping hit, Chattanooga Choo Choo. The very next year, in 1942, the orchestra was back in action in another film, Orchestra Wives. This one was a lively mix of music and drama, telling the story of the band members and their wives while they were on tour. As a bonus, it featured a young Jackie Gleason, who stole scenes as the band's lovable, wise-cracking bassist. Military service. At the height of his success in 1942, Miller made a life-changing decision. He chose to leave behind his wildly popular civilian career, which had earned him an astounding $20,000 a week, to join the armed forces. This decision was even more remarkable because, at 38 years old, Miller was married and wore corrective glasses. He had been classified as 3A for the draft, meaning he was unlikely to be called into service due to his age and family status. Initially, Miller tried to join the U.S. Navy, but his application was rejected. At the time, the Navy was embroiled in a scandal involving celebrities who were allegedly receiving commissions to avoid the draft. Although Miller had no connection to the scandal, it blocked his chance to serve with the Navy. Undeterred, Miller turned to the U.S. Army, where he had already been quietly exploring enlistment possibilities. In March of 1942, during a trip to Washington, he met with officials from the Army Bureau of Public Relations and the Army Air Forces. Then, on August 12, 1942, he sent a detailed 3-page letter to General Charles Young, expressing his passion for modernizing military music and his genuine desire to contribute to the war effort, not out of draft fear, but out of dedication. This letter made its way to General Brayan Somervell, the commander of Army Service Forces, who approved Miller's commission. On September 8, 1942, the Army informed Miller that he had been commissioned, and he was granted a month to wrap up his civilian commitments. On September 24, 1942, Miller performed his final commercial broadcast for Chesterfield Cigarettes. In a memorable and gracious moment, he introduced his competitor, Harry James, as his successor, a gesture James would always remember fondly. Just 2 days later, Miller made his last civilian broadcast on the Coca-Cola Victory Parade of spotlight bands. His final performance with Glenn Miller and his orchestra took place at the Central Theater in Passaic, New Jersey, on September 27, 1942. Then, on October 7, 1942, Miller officially reported for duty at the 7th Service Command in Omaha as a captain in the Army Specialist Corps. After completing a month of training at Fort Meade, Maryland, he was transferred to the Army Air Forces by General Hap Arnold on November 25, 1942. Miller was sent to Maxwell Field in Alabama, where he began working as an assistant special service officer, visiting various AAF training bases to understand the command's mission. His presence was quickly felt as he made appearances on nationwide broadcasts like NBC's Army Hour and played alongside the Rhythmaires, a 15-piece band at local military radio stations, bringing his signature musical style to the troops. Starting on January 1st, 1943, Miller was given a prestigious assignment at the headquarters of the Army Air Force's AAF Technical Training Command, stationed at Knollwood Field in Southern Pines, North Carolina. Reporting directly to General Walter R. Weaver, Miller took on the exciting role of Director of Bands for the AAF-TTC. With his proposal for an official bands program quickly approved, Miller's vision began to take shape. Soon, Miller found himself at the AAF Training Center in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where he handpicked talented musicians for various AAF bass bands across the country. Not only did he help form many of these bands, but he also recruited top-tier talent for a special elite unit he would personally lead. The AAF had already set up its first radio production unit and orchestra in Hollywood, under the command of Major Eddie Dunstetter and musical director Master Sergeant Felix Slatkin. But Miller had an even grander plan in mind. He was tasked with forming and directing the second AAF radio production unit and orchestra, broadcasting and recording from New York. Authorized on March 20th, 1943, Miller's unit was housed at Yale University's AAF Training School in New Haven, Connecticut. The musicians Miller assembled came from the best of both worlds: top jazz players from major big bands and highly skilled classical musicians from leading symphonies. Together, under Miller's direction, they created a groundbreaking fusion of jazz, popular music, and light classical tunes, complete with the addition of strings. A bold and innovative step that pushed beyond the boundaries of Miller's earlier civilian orchestra. This unit would go on to become a powerhouse of entertainment for both troops and the public during the war. The final flight. During their stay in England, the Glenn Miller Orchestra became one of the most sought-after musical acts, performing at countless American air bases and lifting the spirits of the troops with their signature sound. Their music provided a vital boost to morale during tough times. Their radio shows gained a huge following, featuring special guest appearances by big-name American stars like Bing Crosby and Dinah Shore. In one memorable moment, Shore even joined Miller at the famous Abbey Road studios, where they worked on German-language broadcasts aimed at enemy lines. This collaboration showed just how powerful music could be, crossing borders and uplifting those who heard it. The band's music struck a chord with military personnel of all ranks, and their concert at the 8th Air Force headquarters was recorded by the American Forces Network, spreading their harmonious tunes far and wide. By November 1944, Miller, along with his commanding officer David Niven, received permission to move the band from England to France. Paris seemed like the perfect place to base their radio broadcasts, allowing them to entertain both wounded soldiers in hospitals and those on leave from the front lines. However, before they could make the move, they had to tackle the daunting task of pre-recording 80 hours of broadcasts, an exhausting challenge that pushed them to their limits. Meanwhile, preparations in France were moving painfully slowly, adding to Miller's growing frustration. Niven, determined to speed things up, ordered Miller to replace his executive officer, Lieutenant Donald Haynes, and fly to Paris himself to finalize the arrangements. After wrapping up their final pre-recordings and broadcasts on December 12, 1944, Miller and his famous band were preparing for their next mission, to head to France and boost the morale of the troops. Miller had originally booked a flight from London to Paris on December 14th, but bad weather shut down the skies, causing his flight to be canceled. Frustrated by the delay and eager to get his band to their destination, Miller became anxious. He didn't want to fall behind schedule, so when his colleague Jerry Gray mentioned that Lieutenant Colonel Norman Basil had a flight scheduled to France on December 15th, Miller saw an opportunity. Basil was set to fly on a Nordwing UC-64A Norseman, a small aircraft. Although Miller's official travel orders didn't authorize him to fly on that particular plane, he decided to take the chance. Without informing his superiors or the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Chef, Miller accepted Bessel's offer. On the 15th, the Norsemen took off from RAF Twinwood Farm, carrying Miller, Bessel, and pilot John Stuart Morgan. But tragedy struck. Somewhere over the English Channel, the plane vanished into the foggy skies. It never reached France, disappearing without a trace. The very next day, the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge erupted, diverting attention away from the missing aircraft. It wasn't until December 18 that the 8th Air Force and Chef realized something was terribly wrong. Miller, one of the most beloved musicians of the era, had simply vanished. The mystery of what happened to him, Bessel and Morgan, would remain unsolved for years, leaving fans and investigators puzzled by the tragic disappearance. Plane crash or friendly fire? The official story behind the disappearance of Miller's flight is that poor weather conditions were to blame. For several days, dense fog and low clouds had grounded flights, and the weather in France was just as bad. Pilot John Morgan had asked to delay the flight because of the poor visibility, but French air controllers refused his request. Lieutenant Colonel Bessel, however, decided to overrule the controllers and insisted that the flight proceed as planned, hoping to ensure Miller reached Paris on time. This decision added to the tension of the situation. Miller, already nervous about flying, reportedly asked, "Where the hell are the parachutes?" Bessel's reply was, "What's the matter, Miller? Do you want to live forever?" This exchange only heightened the sense of unease and hinted at the tragedy to come. Over the years, various speculations have emerged about what caused the plane's disappearance. Some suggest that the decision to fly in such dangerous conditions was a major factor. There are also concerns that pilot Morgan might not have been fully skilled in flying the Norsemen by instruments alone. This lack of expertise could have led to spatial disorientation, where pilots lose track of direction and altitude, especially in thick clouds. Simulations show that a pilot has just 178 seconds to correct this disorientation before a crash becomes inevitable, meaning Morgan may have had very little time to regain control. Adding to the complexity, the Norseman aircraft from the 1940s was known for carburetor problems that could lead to engine failure. Freezing temperatures at high altitudes could also cause ice to build up on the wings, increasing the risk of an accident. The combination of these issues might have played a role in the tragic loss of the plane and its passengers. However, there are new theories and speculations surrounding Glenn Miller's mysterious disappearance. While bad weather was undoubtedly a factor in Miller's disappearance, a chilling theory suggests that friendly fire might have played a role. On the day Miller's plane went missing, a major bombing raid over Germany had to be canceled because of heavy fog. As the Lancaster bombers returned to base, they needed to get rid of their unused bombs and drop them into a designated area in the English Channel. Navigator Fred Shaw, observing from his bomber, saw the bombs falling into the sea. Out of curiosity, he looked around and spotted a small plane flying 2,500 feet below the Lancaster Formation, heading south. To his horror, he watched as the plane appeared to struggle, then suddenly flipped and crashed into the channel. Shaw's bombardier and rear gunner also saw the crash and reported it. But since the crew wasn't in enemy territory at the time, they didn't undergo a debriefing, and the sighting was never officially recorded. Years later, in 1956, Fred Shaw saw the film The Glenn Miller Story and had a disturbing realization. He wondered if the plane he saw crash might have been Miller's. Checking his logbook, he found that the date and location matched Miller's disappearance. This theory proposes that Miller's plane, following a standard route used by Allied forces to reach France, might have accidentally flown into a no-fly zone near the South Jettison area, where the bombers were disposing of their bombs. With poor visibility and pilot John Morgan's limited experience in instrument flying, it's possible Miller's plane drifted off course and ended up in the path of the returning bombers, leading to it being hit by the jettisoned bombs. However, this theory faces skepticism. Roy Brown, a Lancaster veteran from that raid, doubts that friendly fire was the cause. Brown argues that the poor visibility and chaos of the bombing mission made it unlikely for anyone to spot a small plane like Miller's amidst the over 100 aircraft and dense cloud cover. He also points out the significant altitude difference between the Lancaster's and Miller's plane, suggesting that it would have been very difficult for a bomb to hit the smaller aircraft from such a distance. The controversial theory. Another theory, one that has captured the imaginations of conspiracy theorists and history buffs alike, suggests that Glenn Miller might never have boarded that doomed plane. In 1997, German journalist Udo Ulfkota made a bold and shocking claim. He alleged that secret government documents told a completely different story about Miller's death. According to Ulfkota, Miller didn't perish in a plane crash. Instead, he supposedly died from a heart attack in a Paris brothel while in the company of a prostitute. Ulfkota, who was known for stirring up controversy and embracing conspiracy theories, said he uncovered these documents while researching a book about the BND, Germany's intelligence agency. He argued that Miller's death was deliberately covered up to protect his legacy and preserve morale among the troops. His revelations caused quite a stir, especially after a sensational interview with a German tabloid. However, shortly after the interview, Ulfkota backtracked. He claimed that his statements had been misquoted and admitted that he never actually had the documents he once boasted about. Instead, he now said that the story had been relayed to him by an off-duty BND agent. This sudden retraction casts a shadow over the entire theory. While it is true that Miller's disappearance wasn't officially reported until 9 days after the crash, there remains no concrete proof to support Ulfkota's outrageous claims. The widely accepted explanation, that Miller's plane was lost over the English Channel, remains the most credible account of his tragic fate. Despite the allure of the alternative theory, it remains a tale without substance, leaving the official narrative as the most reliable explanation of what happened to Glenn Miller. The secret agent theory. The idea that Glenn Miller, the renowned band leader, might have been an undercover agent during World War II is captivating. His role in counter-propaganda efforts against the Nazis lends some credibility to this theory. Miller, fluent in German, used his broadcasts to send messages of hope and resistance to German listeners. Adding intrigue to the story is the involvement of actor David Niven, who, like Miller, was part of these broadcasts. Niven's work in Phantom, a special reconnaissance unit, reflects how entertainers were sometimes drawn into covert operations during the war. One particularly compelling theory suggests that Miller's mission in France involved much more than just entertaining troops. Dr. James B. Conant, a former U.S. ambassador, proposed that Miller was actually acting as a diplomat, sent to negotiate peace with high-ranking German officials like Hermann Göring and Gerd von Rundstedt. Conant even speculates that Miller had the authority to offer sanctuary to Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist who would later be pivotal to the U.S. space program. This theory also suggests that Miller's disappearance was no accident, but rather a targeted Nazi plot to sabotage peace talks. Conant's narrative weaves in the mysterious claim that Miller was taken to a Parisian brothel, allegedly a front for Nazi activities, where he was murdered while unconscious. Yet, this story rests on thin evidence. Some circumstantial accounts, and an unverified report from a British soldier who claimed to have seen an American officer's body, supposedly Miller, being removed from a brothel add to the mystery. However, these claims are largely dismissed as unsubstantiated or cases of mistaken identity. Despite the lack of concrete proof, the idea of Miller as a secret agent remains a captivating piece of wartime lore, continuing to fuel speculation and debate. New clues. A new twist has emerged in the long-standing mystery of Glenn Miller's disappearance. In January 2019, Rick Gillespie from TIGHAR, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, shared a promising lead that could finally solve the mystery. Back in 1987, an English fisherman, while trolling in the English Channel, unknowingly brought up pieces of what could have been Miller's missing plane. He contacted the Coast Guard but was advised to discard the debris if it was from World War II, as it might be considered a war grave. Following the Coast Guard's instructions, he returned the wreckage to the sea. Years passed, but something clicked when the fisherman later saw a photograph of Miller's Norseman aircraft. It matched the debris he had found. Remarkably, he had kept a record of the exact location where he had pulled up the wreckage, offering a strong lead for investigators. Rick Gillespie, who has vast experience in recovering historic aircraft, believes this clue could be the real deal. Since Miller's Norseman was the only one of its kind to vanish during the war, identifying it should be relatively simple if the wreckage is found. This discovery could finally unlock the answers to one of World War II's most puzzling disappearances, potentially offering long-awaited closure for fans and history buffs alike. Though the search continues, the hope of finding Glenn Miller's plane lingers, teasing us with the possibility of solving a mystery that has captivated the world for decades. Until then, we can only speculate on what happened to the legendary bandleader on that fateful flight. Honoring Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller's legacy is honored in numerous archives, museums, and memorials across the United States and England. His brother, Herb Miller, led his band in both countries until the late 1980s. In 1953, Universal International Pictures released The Glenn Miller Story, starring James Stewart. However, the film does not include or mention Ray Eberle, Marion Hutton, or Tex Beneke, who were important members of Miller's band. Two towns closely linked to Miller's early life, Clarinda, Iowa, and Fort Morgan, Colorado, hold annual festivals celebrating his memory. Since 1957, Clarinda has hosted the Glenn Miller Festival, featuring performances by the official Glenn Miller Orchestra, led by Nick Hilscher, as well as other jazz bands. The festival also includes visits to Miller's restored birthplace, the Glenn Miller Birthplace Museum, and historical displays from the Glenn Miller Archives at the University of Colorado. Attendees can enjoy lectures about Miller's life and a scholarship competition for young musicians. In 1989, Miller's daughter bought the house where he was born, and the Glenn Miller Foundation now manages its restoration. In Fort Morgan, Colorado, the Glenn Miller Swing Fest has been held every summer since 1996. This festival celebrates Miller's high school days and includes musical performances, swing dancing, community picnics, and lectures. The event helps introduce younger generations to Miller's music and the big band era's dance and fashion styles. It also raises funds for scholarships to the local School for the Performing Arts. Each year, about 2,000 people attend, keeping Miller's memory alive and vibrant. 3 of Glenn Miller's recordings have been honored with induction into the Grammy Hall of Fame. This special Grammy Award, introduced in 1973, recognizes recordings that are at least 25 years old and have significant artistic or historical value. These awards celebrate the lasting impact of Miller's music and its enduring importance in the world of music. What do you think about the controversy surrounding Miller's disappearance? Let us know your opinion in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. The next video promises to be thrilling.